Well, hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. On behalf of Contact North, I'm thrilled to welcome you to today's webinar, Beyond Crystal Balls, an interactive webinar on designing education's plural futures. I'm Sarah Govro, Director of Teach Online and the Online Learning News at Contact North, and I'll be your host today. Just before we begin, I'd like to start with a provincial land acknowledgement. We respectfully acknowledge that Contact North's work and the work of our community partners takes place on traditional Indigenous territories across the province. We are grateful to be able to live and work on these lands. We express gratitude to the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples who have cared for these territories since time immemorial and who continue to strengthen communities across Ontario. A few quick notes before we start. We're using Zoom webinar today, so participants' microphones and cameras will remain off. The chat is open, but please remember to select everyone on the drop-down menu when posting. If you have any questions, kindly use the Q&A tool located at the bottom of the screen. We will have time for questions at the end of the session. And you can also upvote any questions that resonate with you by clicking the thumbs up icon. Live captioning is also available. Simply click the closed caption icon at the bottom of the screen. And after the webinar, I'll post the recording and presentation slides on teachonline.ca. And I'll share that link in the chat shortly. And you'll also receive the link via email within 24 hours. All right, now on to our main event. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. George Veletsianos, Professor of Learning Technologies and the Bonnie Westby Huebner Chair in Education and Technology at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. Welcome, George, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, everyone, and good morning, good afternoon. Thanks for being here. It's very nice to see some familiar names in the chat. And it's exciting to be here for this webinar hosted by our friends at Contact North. So my name is George Veletsianos, and I live in the US. I'm Canadian by choice and Cypriot by birth. I'm Professor of Learning Technologies, like Sarah mentioned. And my research over the last 20 years has focused on making sense of student and faculty experiences and practices with emerging technologies as a way to improve teaching and learning. In this work, I've interacted with some of you, at least as researchers, as colleagues, mostly when I was in BC for the last 10 years. And being back in the US now, I do very similar work, just in different contexts. And contexts are very, very important, and we'll be touching upon that in my talk today. So in this talk, we're going to sort of embark on a journey together. And I have a question for you to start with. And that question is, what should education look like in the future? It's probably a question that you asked yourselves in the past, but note that the question isn't what it might look like, and it's not about what it could look like, but it's about what it should look like. Because there's a difference between should and would and could. Might and could are about possibilities, but should, that's about responsibility. It's about the future or futures that we choose to create. Now, humans have always been fascinated with imagining the future of education. Take a look at this image, and it's probably an image that you've seen before. It's a vision from the 1900s of what school would look like in the year 2000. Students plugged into knowledge machines. The artist probably got that one wrong, but also notice what they got right. They understood that education would be influenced by technology. They just couldn't imagine how. Ironically, they also understood that there would still be classrooms and that students would still be sitting in rows, oftentimes passively receiving content. And that's part of our challenge today. We're living through unprecedented change, economic upheaval, demographic changes, climate crisis, technological revolution, cultural tensions, geopolitical tensions. These are not distant threats or opportunities. They're here now, and they're promising to sort of reshape the future of education. But what this picture reminds us is that imagining the future is sort of a constant human endeavor. It's not always straightforward. So this session isn't about predicting the future, and there's no singular future for us to arrive to. There are multiple futures, and they're not predetermined. They're designed, they're influenced, just like the present that we live in right now. And so if 3 days from now or a month from now, you remember nothing else from this session, I hope that you'll remember this. The futures of education are not predetermined. We have a role in shaping them. All of us in this room have a role in that, have a role to play. So here's a bit of an overview. Here's what I'm not going to do today. I'm not going to stand here for 45 minutes and tell you what I think the future holds, because frankly, no one person can or really should define that future. Instead, we're going to do something more interesting. We're going to explore multiple possible futures together. We'll use a structured scenario planning technique to examine not just one future, but many futures. And this goes to the sort of the core message that I was just sharing. Education futures are not something that happen to us. The futures of education are something that we create through our actions, but also crucially through our inactions. Everyone in this webinar has agency. Every one of us can influence what education in our own particular context can become. I'd like to start with a very short and quick poll for all of us here, and I'll ask Sarah to bring it up. When you think about higher education in 2035, which statement best describes your gut feeling? Is the future going to be mostly like today, just with incremental improvements? Are there going to be major disruptions? Are technology companies going to have main impact? There's a few options here. Please take a few moments to pick some of these. Just gonna keep a number on the number of participants, just to get most responses in here. I'm seeing about half of us responding. Could be open for a few more seconds. All right, let's get a few more responses in. All right, Sarah, I think we're ready to close the poll. All right. Interesting. So, let's see a split here. 23% of you saying that major disruptions are coming, but we can't really predict what the future education might look like. Now 23% chose technology companies will shape the future more than educators, speaking to maybe an equal power in shaping those futures. And this is one area that I'm going to talk about in a little bit. Sort of this belief that there are powerful external forces that might determine sort of our fate. And 23% saying higher education as we know it may not exist in its current form. That might be both an optimistic and an pessimistic perspective, and I'm not quite sure where that will go. Thanks for sharing. I want to start by telling you a story about the power of asking the question, what if? So I was born and grew up in Cyprus, which is a small island in the northeast corner of the Mediterranean Sea. In 1974, the island was divided in two, with Greek Cypriots who used to live in the north moving to the south, and Turkish Cypriots who used to live in the south moving to the north. I want to zoom in here and show you the black dotted line that you see on this map as the buffer zone that exists currently between the north and the south. And if you can zoom in a little bit more, I've traced a red line here so you can see it. Nicosia in the middle there is the capital. It's the last divided capital in Europe. In the 1990s, a group of Greek Cypriot and Turkish Cypriot teachers wanted to promote conflict resolution and peace building among youth in Cyprus. Their idea was to bring Greek Cypriot youth and Turkish Cypriot youth together and to symbolically do it in the buffer zone. They thought that, or they understood that youth grew up hearing stories about one another, but never meeting one another. And by bringing them together physically and showing them commonalities between their cultures, they would start building sort of foundations for peace. So it was a forward-looking idea that departed from any kind of current practice on the island. But it also sounds a little wild and absurd. Who in their right mind would take youth who are taught to hate one another, walk them through an active military border, and have them hang out in sort of a military or demilitarized zone? Yet that's what they did. I was one of those 30 teenagers, 15 from one side, 15 from the other, who crossed the border and went into the buffer zone to meet at the Lidra Palace Hotel, which is this hotel that I'm showing here. Since 1974, this hotel has been used by the UN peacekeeping forces as headquarters and meeting place. As an aside, lots of Canadians have served in the UN peacekeeping force in Cyprus. You needed special permission to go, not just to the hotel, but to cross the border. You had to walk through a checkpoint on both sides of the border. Visits were complicated and most of the times not allowed, except for like cultural exchanges and so on. So we crossed the border, so we could be together in this no man's land. We played games common to both communities. We figured out words that are common in both Greek and Turkish and so on. And that experience stayed with me, but only recently did I truly appreciate the designers of that experience, our teachers. They looked at the existing system of sort of division and separation and said, this isn't working. This isn't who we want to be, and what if we tried something else? What if? What if it were otherwise? What if it were different? And that simple question, the what if question, is incredibly powerful. And it's the question that I want us to hold today. What if our current education systems aren't inevitable? What if they're just one possibility among many? And what if we could design something better? And I know that many of you have been involved in this work. Many of you have been doing distance and online education for years and decades, right? That's one approach through which distance education has come about, by asking, what if? What if education doesn't necessarily happen in the same place at the same time with the same people? So what if we dare to imagine differently? Someone somewhere designed the education systems that we have. They're all made up. They represent someone's ideas, values, ideals, notions about how the world works. We are sustaining them with our work, with our research, with our teaching. What if we keep what works and reject the rest? What if questions are important to consider, but at this point in time, they're also urgent. We know that higher education is facing many pressures. The pandemic has accelerated and amplified pre-existing trends. Climate change is impacting us. tech and AI are advancing, there's militarized conflict, mass migration, economic inequality, it goes on and on and on. Reduction of public funding, questions about the purposes and need for higher education. It's sort of never ending. We live in a world that researchers have described as consisting of multiple and overlapping challenges, a world that's volatile, it's uncertain, it's ambiguous. And so when we ask what higher education might look like in the future in 2030, 2035, and so on, we might be wondering things like, is it mostly online? Is AI meaningfully integrated? Do we have robot teachers? Do students have brain implants? What is and what isn't taught? Is education regularly disrupted by hurricanes, by snowstorms, by extreme heat? When I was living in Victoria, we had extreme heat, we had extreme rain. Now I'm living in Minnesota. Very similar. I used to live in Minnesota in the past, maybe 15 years ago. Our summers have many more thunderstorms. Our winters are becoming more mild. So these changes you might also have been noticing in your own contexts. But the question of, what happens in our context, I think is really important. So what higher education might look like in a public school in Minneapolis versus a private school in Houston versus an outdoor school in Victoria, BC, versus an educational experience in Thunder Bay, and the list goes on and on. The differences are many and they're varied. So in conversations about the future of education, it's very important, I think, to account for sort of local realities and local differences. So one way to work towards more imaginative environments about education futures is to spend more time with speculative methods. Speculative methods are approaches that examine the possible futures of education, often from a critical perspective. For example, these methods might generate stories or scenarios that we or our students write about as they relate to the future of education. These stories are not supposed to predict the future. They're sort of invitations to imagine what the future might look like. And writing stories about the future education might seem like a frivolous exercise, but what stories about the future of education reveal is that what matters to us in the present moment. So if I write a story about a future university in which artificial intelligence takes care of all the time-consuming and uninteresting things that I have to do, like, well, I don't know, categorizing expenses, double-checking course numbers, keeping track of spreadsheets, then that tells you something about parts of my job that I don't enjoy and would like to automate right now. Yes, I'm talking about the future, but that is an indication of sort of obstacles or uninteresting things that are happening at my work at present. It tells you what I think is a problem that is an obstacle to doing my job better right now. So when you read stories about the future of education or you think about the future of education, it is important to really tune in and ask, what does this tell me about the present? And I think that is also indicative of certain values that we may hold. So when you read stories that others write about the future that might, for example, speak to automating teaching or automating assessment, that is also an indication to sort of pinpoint sort of values that people hold or might not hold that might conflict with yours and so on, or with the education system at large. These two authors sort of capture this beautifully. They define radical imagination as the idea of, or as the ability to imagine the world life and social institutions not as they currently are, but as they might otherwise be. And this is precisely the muscle that we need to strengthen, because every education system that we navigate today, every curriculum, every activity, every assessment, every institutional structure that we either design or work with was imagined into being by someone. And the systems embody particular values, particular assumptions about how the world works and how people learn. And if these assumptions don't serve us, then we should be asking, what might we imagine instead? Now, when we start imagining education futures, it's tempting to swing between extremes. Some of us envision technological utopias where AI tutors solve every problem and every child reaches their full potential. And that might be for some their educational unicorn. And others descend into sort of dystopian nightmares where surveillance capitalism has colonized the classroom, human connection, it's extinct, and that's our monster on the left. But reality is probably messier than that. The future is likely not to be purely utopian or purely dystopian. It'll probably be complex, contradictory, unevenly distributed. Some students might thrive while others are left behind, and some innovations might liberate while others might constrain. And I think this is one of the reasons why we need to think of plural futures, multiple scenarios existing simultaneously, different futures all constrained and made possible as a result of many factors. But if imagination is so powerful as to allow us to sort of create and put in practice futures that are bright, if imagination is so powerful, what holds us back? Why do we often, or so often, default to incremental changes rather than transformative possibilities? I think there's two concepts that might help to explain these. First is what Annette Markham calls discursive closures, which refers to the way our conversations about the future become sort of unconsciously narrow. Certain ideas get repeated so often that they seem inevitable. Ideas like in-person education is better than online learning. AI will improve education. Students today have short attention spans. These kinds of statements close down imagination rather than opening it up. They lead us to believe that we cannot change the future, that there are limited choices for the future, or that some choices are unavoidable. Which is why I often sound like a broken record when I keep telling people that comparing in-person education to online education is like comparing apples to bananas. They're different. And you do not need to talk about one being better than the other. And that I've been repeating that mantra for as long as I can remember, and I know that many of you have been doing the same, but it is important to keep repeating it for new folks who are entering the conversation, for folks who are navigating back after the pandemic into in-person ideas, or talking about blue book exams now to address some of the shortcomings or some of the issues that generative AI is bringing up. The second idea that sort of limits our imagination is this idea of elite futurism. This basically refers to the dominance of a small group of voices in shaping visions for the future. Usually these voices come from Silicon Valley, from philanthropists, from policymakers, and so on. They're not necessarily wrong, but they're partial. They represent particular interests, particular ways of seeing. And let's be honest, there are powerful interests at play in education's future. There are companies that are seeking markets, there are governments that are seeking control, there are institutions that are seeking survival. This would be, your Google, your Microsoft, your OpenAI telling you that artificial intelligence is inevitable, that there's no higher education future without it. It's the same companies that are telling you that AI is a co-pilot and a learning partner. It's Microsoft Teams and Zoom telling you that their platform for teaching and learning continuity during the pandemic is necessary, and selling you the platform with the aim to become sort of plumbing components basically for your university, right? Intertwining themselves with your operations such that you can no longer see a future without them. They're now part of your LMS, part of your training. They become infrastructure, right? Breaking up with them is difficult and costly. Case in point, we're using Zoom. And of course, technology is powerful and useful, right? I'm not rejecting it. The problem isn't technology itself. The problem is that the never-ending stories about the potential of technology lead us to limit our imagination and work towards futures that serve powerful interests. So part of our job today is to make those interests visible and ask whose future is being imagined, who benefits, who is left out, what are the alternatives? Okay, I'm going to pause there and bring up another poll. I'm curious to hear from you which of these factors most limits you think most limits your ability to imagine different educational futures at your institution. Is it that we've always done things this way? Is it budget constraints, lack of time, and so on and so forth? Give it a few moments there and take a sip of my tea. See, about half of you have responded. Let's get some more responses before sharing the results. Okay, let's send the poll, Sarah, and share the results. As you can see here, most folks are saying that we've always done it this way, and that sort of shapes our ability to imagine differently. Budget and resource constraints to put into action our perhaps our thoughts and ideas and imaginations, and lack of time to actually engage in strategic thinking and thinking alternatively. I'll stop sharing that poll. So how do we push back against these limitations? How do we make time? How do we open up our collective imagination? One powerful tool that is available to us is scenario planning. It's a method that doesn't try to predict the future, but instead maps out several sort of plausible futures and explores their implications. In other words, scenario planning identifies a specific set of uncertainties, identifies different realities of what might happen in the future, and allows us to think through those in detail. Today, we're going to use a sort of simplified version of scenario planning based on JISC's Imagine Futures methodology. JISC is from the UK. Think of it as a sort of structured daydreaming with a purpose. We'll use what-if scenarios that I've generated that are combined at random and give you some time to explore them. Not necessarily to find the right answer, but to maybe stretch our thinking and uncover new possibilities. Examining multiple possible futures prepares us for and both us and our institutions for uncertainties, because when we do that, we can, think through potential risks and opportunities. We can challenge our assumptions about the future, and we can develop strategies that might be robust across different sort of outcomes and different possibilities. So in the next slide, I'm going to bring up a QR code and a website for you to spend about 5 minutes with. But before you do that, I want to talk a little bit about the activity. Okay, so here's how the scenario planning activity will work. First, I'll give you 5 minutes for this activity, and I'll set a timer. You'll navigate to this website by either using that link or using the QR code that's there, and you'll come to a web page. And the web page will bring up a couple of buttons, and one of those buttons will generate random educational scenarios for 2035. I want you to sort of click the button, use the first feature that comes, or keep clicking until you're happy with the 3 scenarios that are generated. And take some time to think about those 3 scenarios in which take some time to think about the scenario in which those 3 what ifs become a reality. Some questions to ask yourselves might be, what are the risks and opportunities that are presented by each one of this? How could an institution react to the challenge that lies on the screen to mitigate risks, to maximize opportunities? How could educators prepare for or react to the challenges? So remember that this isn't about finding perfect answers. It's about exploring possibilities. It's about surfacing assumptions. It's about thinking through what you're seeing on the screen in relation to your own institution. Try to be bold, try to be critical and creative, and take some notes for yourself. I'll ask a question later on where I'm going to be asking you to share some of those notes. So I'll bring up a timer, a 5-minute timer, and then give you that time to look at those scenarios and take some notes on these questions that we have here. And then when the 5 minutes are up, I'm going to bring us all back in the room, and I'll be asking you at some point to share. All right, I'll pause my audio and let you work with the scenarios on that site. In the meantime, if there's questions, please feel free to put them in the chat.
George, I see what you posted in the chat, but only I can see that. If you hit everyone on the pull down menu, then the rest of the participants will be able to see that.
Thank you, Sarah. There's about a minute and a half remaining. I'll give you that minute to think through the scenarios and the what ifs that you're seeing on your screen. Okay, everyone, that was our 5 minutes. If you'd like to come back to the main slide deck. Thanks for taking the time and for spending time with those questions. I hope they sparked some interesting ideas. I would like to bring up the third poll for the day. Based on the scenarios that you've seen so far, and those scenarios where, as you saw, divided into different categories, I'm wondering which category feels most urgent for your institution to prepare for right now. Is it technology disruption? Is it social economic changes? Is it policy? Is it environmental? Just to get a sense of, what is the area that feels urgent? Oftentimes in our field, we talk about technological disruptions, and especially when I work with PhD students, which I often do, technology is sort of front and center. And lots of people want to study technology, focus their research on technology. And while a major disruptor, there are also so many other forces that shape our teaching, the future of our institutions, education as a whole. So let's end the poll there and see what people are thinking. Pedagogical, sort of areas seem urgent, social and economic areas, and then have a split between technology, policy, and human-centered sort of categories. Thanks for sharing that. Notice how quickly we moved from what if to then what. Imagine that as you're thinking through these categories, you start wondering how various activities at your institutions might change or might need to change. This is what I like to call sort of pedagogical recalibration, the deep rethinking that these scenarios might demand of us. They might force us to examine things like our core values. How do transparency, academic freedom, and inclusion do in these futures? What new values might we need? It might force us to examine our teaching approaches. What becomes obsolete? What becomes essential? How do we teach for worlds that we can't fully predict? How do we prepare in advance that rather than as a response, which is something that you're seeing happening with sort of this push for a return to in-person exams and blue book exams and so on, right? That is a reaction as opposed to a predetermined or sort of a pre-advanced change in assessment practices. They might force us to examine our assessment methods, right? If knowledge is instantly accessible, what do we assess? If AI can write essays, what do grades mean? They might also force us to examine our institutional relationships. With tech companies increasingly shaping educational tools, how do we maintain autonomy in our classrooms? As student needs evolve, how do our support structures sort of change and adapt? Last week, I saw an ad outside of my classroom. One of the tools that we use at my current university, or that is available to everyone, is Google Gemini, which is a generative AI tool. And there was an ad outside of the classroom that essentially said, Gemini helps you take charge of your time, or something like that. Convert a long reading into an engaging 5-minute read, which in functional terms, it's accurate, but in pedagogical terms, it seems like it is taking over or encroaching upon pedagogical practices. So this idea of tech companies not just shaping educational tools, but sort of having impacts on pedagogical practice that we might be using as individual faculty, or that the institution might adopt, I think is an interesting sort of conundrum in our current age. Pedagogical recalibration might also invite us to examine our knowledge practices, right? In a world in which, in a world of information abundance and sort of deep fakes, as you might have seen with the release of Sora 2 last week, how is it that we define expertise? How do we validate truth? These are not just intellectual exercises, right? They're urgent questions and they demand answers, because the future is already here, it's already arriving, it's unevenly distributed across our institutions. And I talked about my institution having access to Gemini. I know that lots of other institutions don't, but I also know that lots of other institutions have more advanced tools at their disposal than my current institution. So this landscape of inequality, even when you're at sort of a high resource research one institution, is sort of prevalent. Okay, here's my last poll, and it's a short answer, and I haven't tried a short answer before, so I'm curious how this might go. I would like you to complete the sentence that's going to come up. The one thing that I'm going to do differently when I return to my institution is the following. If you don't, I'm seeing the poll on my screen. If you don't have space to type in the poll, I'll say type in the chat so we can all see that. And maybe I'll give you a minute to do that. So I'm going to keep a timer on my phone. I thought that the poll will come up and you would be able to type there, but it doesn't seem like that. Or maybe it does. Sarah, are you seeing something differently on your end?
No, to be honest, this is the first time I've used a short question answer as well.
Okay.
When when I viewed it on my end, you can preview it when you are creating the polls. And it does provide a 200 and I think I set the limit for 230
Okay.
characters.
Okay.
But how it presents itself, I have no idea. So we'll see when we end the poll.
So I'm seeing folks responding. So it looks like there's space for responses. Yeah, folks are saying, oh, hi, Elizabeth. Folks are saying that they are able to do it on that poll. So I will wait for a few more seconds, and then we will end the poll, and I imagine that those results are going to come in magically through the power of Zoom. I am seeing in the chat, though, Jason says that the one thing that they are going to take with them is asking the question of what if more often, which I love that. Thank you, Jason. Let's end the poll in 10 seconds, just so that we can see.
Sorry, I jumped the gun.
That's okay. Sorry, everyone. Okay, I'm gonna try and share results. We're able to see them.
Here, I'll try from my end. I think if you hit view details, it pops up on another, if you hit view details, it pops up on another screen. I don't know if you're able to see that, George.
I don't have that on my end. Might you be able to share it or copy paste it somewhere?
Yep, I'll copy and paste in the chat. 1 sec.
Okay. Thanks everyone for your patience and allowing us to try something new. And as you might have expected, when you try something new, something always doesn't go as planned, which is sort of the way that our field often operates.
All right, I took a screenshot because it also produces a nice little word cloud. So it's me 1 second. I'll put it in the chat. Here you go.
Okay. Let's see what I can do here. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen of the screenshot. Asking what if, speaking up to remind people to consider and not shut down what if possibilities, be open to extreme possibilities and plural futures, be more skeptical of the value of all types of planning, rethinking my particular goals in my particular instruction. I love that because it connects to a very particular thing, very contextual thing that we're doing on an individual level. Opening up a more serious discussion on how do we need to reevaluate our methods. There are additional ones here that I can't scroll through, but perhaps we can share them when we share the recording. I'm gonna go back to sharing my screen, my PowerPoint, just to end. So we began with teenagers sort of crossing a divide in Cyprus, made possible by teachers who dare to ask what if. We explore how imagination can be both more powerful and constrained, and we used a scenario planning activity to examine multiple futures. Throughout it, I insisted that plural futures, not just one future, is necessary to think about. The thread connecting all of these things is agency. Those teachers in Cyprus didn't wait for perfect conditions. They didn't have a guarantee for success. They simply decided that the current reality was unacceptable to them, and they took action to create a different one. And that's our opportunity and our responsibility. education futures are being designed right now in decisions that we make, both small and large, and in decisions that others make, both small and large. They rest on the technologies that we adopt or resist, in the voices that we amplify or choose to ignore, in the possibilities that we explore or dismiss. So my challenge to you, which is what Jason just shared, is to take the what if spirit with you. Return to your institutions not with answers, but with better questions. Gather colleagues and students and ask, what futures are we creating? Whose interests are they serving? What possibilities are we forecasting? And start small. Maybe maybe start by reimagining a single assessment, maybe questioning a policy that everyone takes for granted, maybe build bridges between communities that rarely interact. But whatever you do, don't wait for that future to happen to you. While we can't predict exactly what education will look like in the future, we can be certain that it will be shaped by the choices that we're making today. That future is not inevitable, it's not predetermined. It's a design project, and because you're in this field, I know that you're all designers. Thank you for your engagement, for your time and creativity and sharing, and for your commitment to sort of imagining better educational futures. I think we might have some time for a Q&A, so I'm going to stop there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, George. Very inspiring. We do have some questions in the Q&A that are queued up. The first one is from Sir John Daniel. How was the use of these methods? Let me start again. How has the use of these methods changed things at the University of Minnesota?
Great question. Thank you for that one. I'll preface this by saying that I have been at the University of Minnesota for a year and a half since moving here from Royal Roads University. So I don't have an answer that might be expected just by virtue of not being here for a long time. But I can answer that question in terms of our particular program of learning technologies. We have been spending time over the last year asking those what if questions in terms of the future of the program, right? What is it that we need to teach? What if all of our instruction was online? What if our PhD program was developed differently? What if, our home and curriculum and instruction isn't our permanent home? What if we embraced interdisciplinarity a bit more? So all of those questions are leading us to chart some exciting possibilities. But that's basically where we are right now. I know that that's not maybe the answer that one was expecting, but we're in the process of applying some of these ideas into thinking about the program itself.
Hey, thank you for that. I have a question from Agnes. Regarding the story you told at the start when you and a few others were taken to the buffer zone in Cyprus, what was the expectation as to what real changes would be brought about by the experience? Were you expected to take some action after you went back home?
Great question. Thank you, Agnes, and it's great to see you here. There were small actions that we were expected to take, or at least activities. So, for example, we started corresponding through letters at the time with friends that we made, in that experience. But I think the larger, sort of broader, and I don't know if this was, verbalized or perhaps it was unspoken at the time, the larger, broader maybe expectation was that the future of the island depends on youth. And by bringing people together, I think the idea was that when people grow up, when people take on leadership positions, they might make certain choices or take certain actions or adopt various stances that might allow for an end to the conflict. I think that was the larger goal and aspiration. But it was small, starting with small actions at the time.
Great, thanks for that, George. I will do one more question before we wrap up. Carla asks, do you see AI as a threat to traditional higher education models or as an opportunity to innovate? And what kinds of skills do you think universities should prioritize in an AI-driven world where we don't know what the world or jobs we're preparing students for?
I see higher education um, and technology sort of co-evolving with society. I think we often tend to think of our education systems as being static, but the reality is that they have evolved over time, concomitant with society changing. So, for example, the invention of the printing press changed the idea of scholarship and how a scholarship takes place and who scholars are, and sort of brought about sort of the development of research assistants and so on. It changes the idea of like sort of monastic knowledge. So I think that our educational systems, our universities will evolve with generative AI and with other technologies that are sort of evolving. I don't quite know what that would look like. I think there are opportunities for innovation and change, not necessarily as a result of AI only, but I do think that our institutions can serve many more people in many more ways. Sir John Daniel was here, and some of his work has been inspiring in my work. I think in thinking through, distance education, the people that we serve, I think we still have a lot to do. And I think that change in our higher education systems is important and necessary, sort of independent of the technologies that are sort of available to us.
All right, well, that will conclude our brief Q&A session. I just wanted to thank you, George, for such an insightful and thought-provoking presentation. You've definitely given us much to reflect on as we consider the future of higher education. And thank you to all of you for joining today. Your questions and comments have really added to the conversation, and we appreciate the time you took to be here and to engage so actively. Just a quick reminder that the recording and slides will be posted on teachonline.ca under the webinar series, and you'll also receive a link by email in about 24 hours. If you do have any questions or feedback, please don't hesitate to reach out. We'll love to hear from you. And I hope to see you again at our next webinar, which will be October 23rd, Why Universal AI Rules Don't Work, How to Build Responsive AI Policies with Your Students. Hosted by Dr. Veletsianos, Assistant Professor of Digital Technologies and Education at the at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, also known as OISE, at the University of Toronto. So thanks again, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, George. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.